Sure.
Good evening. I would like to start by welcoming y'all to this webinar. My name is Rachel Field. I'm Program Manager for an Episcopal Path to Creation Justice. And I'd like to offer a note of welcome to everybody who's coming in tonight on behalf of both an Episcopal Path for Creation Justice, which is a ministry in the Eco region in Province 1, and on behalf of Sewanee. And just wanted to introduce tonight our speaker, who's coming to us from the Center for Religion and Environment. It is my deep joy to welcome Dr. Andrew Thompson, who is Associate Professor of Ethics at the School of Theology. His work focuses on environmental ethics and eco-theology, especially around environmental racism and colonialism, and lay episcopal ethics. His first book, Sacred Mountains, A Christian Ethical Approach to Mountaintop Removal, applies a critical ethical lens to the debate over surface mining in his home region of Appalachia. His most recent book is Reconsider the Lilies, Challenging Christian Environmentalism's Colonial Legacy, and his current project focuses on lay Episcopal theologians Vida Dutton Scudder, William Stringfellow, and Verna Dozer. Dr. Thompson earned his PhD in religion from Yale University and an MAR from Yale Divinity School. He also holds a BA in music performance from Duquesne University. And since coming to Sewanee, he has served as assistant director for the Center for Religion and Environment, director of the Alternative Clergy Training at Sewanee program, and director of the Sewanee Ministry Collaborative. In addition to all of this, Dr. Thompson has served for many years on the Episcopal Church's Task Force for Care Creation and Environmental Racism, for which he drafted policies on carbon offsetting and environmental reparations. He now serves on the church's Task Force for AI and Intellectual Property. He was a missionary to El Salvador, has supported environmental education and reforestation projects in the Dominican Republic and Burundi, and facilitated a bilingual eco-theology course at the Seminario Evangelico de Teología in Matanzas, Cuba. Andy's wife, the Rev. Lee Preston, is interim associate university chaplain at Sewanee, and they have two kids, Cabell and Cullen, and two dogs, Lulu and Oscar. And Andrew, it is my deep joy to be able to welcome you into this space tonight. Thank you so much for the opportunity to collaborate and share this important information.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. I'm really grateful for the connection that we have developed recently in this ecoregion work, and we'll say a little bit more about that. But really grateful to the whole Episcopal Path for Creation Care that the work that you've done there, and excited for this opportunity to collaborate. So yeah, I'm at the Center for Religion and Environment in Sewanee, and have had the opportunity to um, develop a lot of relationships with a lot of folks doing really important creation care work. I'm sure many of the folks on in the audience on this call are uh, folks that have been involved in that kind of work in the Episcopal Church in other contexts as well, and I really look forward to whatever conversation we can get going after I've done my presentation. Look forward to hearing from folks' own experiences of that. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen now, just a moment. And uh, is that showing up okay, Rachel? Could you yeah, good. All right. So our topic for this evening is I'm taking the title from my most recent book, Reconsider the Lilies, but the focus is on white supremacy and environmental justice, on how issues of race and issues of whiteness figure into environmental issues in ways that at this point may be somewhat familiar, and in other ways that are perhaps less familiar. My experience in the church has often been, especially a while back, my experience was often that people had trouble seeing the connections between issues of racial justice and environmental justice. Thankfully, that is becoming more familiar to a lot of people, but I think there are still some important conversations to be had. So a lot of this comes from my book that Rachel mentioned, Reconsider the Lilies. that came out a couple years back, and then some of it represents directions that I've been developing and having conversations around since. So the way this conversation or the way this presentation is going to go, first, I want to talk about environmental racism. What do we mean by environmental racism? And along with that, environmental justice and environmental injustice. Some key terms that, again, may be familiar, but maybe bear some fleshing out a little bit. And then I want to ask this question: is green Christianity white? I have to express my gratitude to my editor at Fortress Press, Ryan Hemmer. He's the one that came up with this turn of phrase. It became the title of one of my chapters. Um, but I think it's a question worth asking. In what ways does Christian environmentalism specifically, and perhaps unwittingly and unintentionally, perpetuate certain white privilege and certain ideas that are associated with whiteness? And then how do we move forward from that? How do we try to do better? Before I continue, I think it's really important to highlight other authors who have been saying really important things in some of these areas, authors of color who've been saying these things for quite a while. And I'll touch on some of these as I go through the presentation. But authors who have been writing from their perspectives about environmental justice, about anti-racist theology and anti-oppressive theologies, and about decoloniality or post-colonial thinking. I'll say a little bit more about some of those ideas as I go. But I want to name some of these specifically, and these are authors that I drew on really heavily in developing my own arguments in my book and continue to in my own research and teaching. Robert Bullard, who I'll say a bit about in a moment, is often described as the father of environmental justice. He is the scholar most responsible for documenting and describing and exploring the environmental justice movement, and specifically activism around environmental inequality and especially racial inequality as it relates to environmental harms. He's got a whole list of books around this and around different examples of environmental injustice, but Dumping in Dixie was his first book that really brought that issue to the fore. But anything by Robert Bullard is a key text for this area. Christopher Carter is a scholar who's doing some contemporary work in this. In his book, The Spirit of Soul Food, Race, Faith, and Food Justice, obviously addresses these issues specifically from the approach of food. And in fact, he even includes some recipes. He makes an argument for vegetarianism, for vegetarian soul food as a kind of decolonial and anti-racist practice, and includes recipes in his book. So there you're getting an academic book as well as a cookbook. Kelly Brown Douglas is an Episcopal theologian and one of the most significant Episcopal theologians working right now. And her book, Stand Your Ground, addresses issues of whiteness in Christian theology, as they relate to contemporary social issues. It addresses specifically um, the murders of Black people by police that have happened far too often in our recent history, and the culture of whiteness and the theologies of whiteness that underlie those. Willie James Jennings, another really significant theologian working around these intersections and showing how key ideas in Christian theology really incorporate some racist and colonialist impulses in them that date all the way back to what we describe uh, sometimes as the age of discovery, back to the age when Europeans first colonized the Americas. And so he traces some of those threads really, really excellently. And again, I relied on him a lot. Robin Wall Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass. Many of you are probably familiar with this text. Just a gorgeous text and one of the most enjoyable books you'll ever read, but exploring environmentalism from her perspective as both a biologist and an indigenous person. And she really traces those intersections really beautifully. And then Gloria Ansaldúa, Luz en lo Oscuro, Light in the Darkness. Ansaldúa is a key thinker in decolonial thought, and again, a really really interesting, really fascinating text that explores colonialism from her perspective as a mestiza, that is a Mexican American, no, sorry, as a Chicana, as a Mexican American thinker, and just a really, really beautiful and provocative text there. So I highly recommend checking out those texts for a lot of the really important voices on some of these issues. Now, I want to continue on with the topics for today. First, as I said, we're going to talk about environmental racism and what we mean by environmental racism. This term is often traced to Warren County, North Carolina in 1982. In the years leading up to that, there was illegal dumping of PCB, the toxic chemical PCB, in a large area around North Carolina. And when this was discovered, they needed to clean it up and they needed to put it somewhere. And so they wanted to create a PCB landfill in Warren County, North Carolina, which was a poor and predominantly African American community. And they were doing this against the wishes of any of the residents of Warren County. And so they began to protest this unjust creation of this PCB landfill on the grounds that they were being specifically targeted because, as a community of color, as a predominantly African American community, they did not have the opportunity to oppose this. They didn't have the political capital to oppose this, and it was being imposed against their will. And ultimately, those protests did not succeed. The landfill was created. It did, unsurprisingly, fail and contaminate the land and the air around Warren County, North Carolina. But in the process of these protests, they drew a lot of attention to this issue. And this was where, according to the stories, this was where the term environmental racism was first coined by Benjamin Chavis, who was an activist and one of the leaders of some of these protests. He's often attributed as having first described this as environmental racism. That was given further definition by the United Church of Christ in a couple of reports, one called Toxic Waste and Race in 1987, and then another one called Toxic Waste and Race at 20, published 20 years later in 2007. Benjamin Chavis, who I just mentioned, the first person allegedly to use this term, environmental racism, was one of the authors of this original text, Environmental Waste or Toxic Waste and Race at 20. And in that, they exhaustively documented the ways that race is the primary indicator of what communities will be most likely to suffer from toxic environmental harms, like toxic landfills, polluting industries. And they showed statistically that after controlling for other factors, including things like income, wealth, anything else that might contribute to this, even after controlling for that, race was the primary indicator of who would be most likely to be subject to these environmental harms. In other words, statistically, people of color were more likely, because of their race, to be disproportionately exposed to environmental harms. You can see one demonstration of this in this graph that came from the 2007 report showing the percentage of people of color living near hazardous waste facilities, and then that's broken down by which ethnicity those people are. But you can see the high percentages here way disproportionate to the populations, the percentage of the population represented by these groups, right? So again, even after controlling for any other factors, they demonstrated this conclusively in this United Church of Christ report. And I think it's significant that it was the United Church of Christ, that it was a religious group that documented this. Many of the activists in Warren County and in many of the other protests around environmental justice in the environmental justice movement came from religious communities, came from churches. That's where a lot of the activism came from. And it's an important theological movement, I think, in that respect. And so the fact that it was the United Church of Christ that first documented this and really brought attention to it, I think is significant. Then in the 20 years follow-up report, United Toxic Waste and Race at 20 from 2007, they documented that, in fact, these environmental injustices, the unequal distribution of environmental harms by race, had actually gotten worse in the 20 years since they had first reported it. Not only had it not improved, but it had in fact gotten worse. So that follow-up showed that the issue was still very much with us. So in that report, they give a definition in the 2007 report, give a definition of what environmental racism refers to. And it refers to any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages, whether intended or unintended, individuals, groups, or communities based on race or color. So notice here, and this is one of the key ideas that conversations around systemic racism often highlight, that this is about the effects of policies, practices, or directives, not the intentions behind them, right? Often still, and this they put this definition out in 2007, but still you often hear, you know, people protest that policies or practices are not necessarily intentionally racist. Sometimes, first of all, sometimes they are intentionally racist, and it's important to name that. But here they're saying also that whether or not there are racist intentions behind it, any policy that leads to unequal environmental impacts, unequal environmental harms, according to race or color, is environmentally racist, is an example of environmental racism. And I think that's important to be aware of. We can think of environmental racism as a category within this broader category of environmental injustice. And environmental injustice names broadly the ways that environmental harms are unequally distributed, or alternatively, the ways environmental benefits are also unequally distributed, right? So that would be in broader categories, not always about race, but it includes environmental racism as one form of environmental injustices. Then the converse of that is environmental justice. And environmental justice names grassroots movements like Warren County, North Carolina, that evolved to protest against environmental injustices, that protest against the unequal distribution of environmental harms. Again, often according to race, but not exclusively. Some of them are break down along different kinds of divides. Class, income, gender is often a key one as well. Right, all of those are environmental justice movements and combating different kinds of environmental injustice. So all of this is kind of the background to this question that I raise in the book and that I want to consider here tonight, which is the question of, is green Christianity white? The environmental justice movement, when it first emerged in the late 70s and early 1980s, was often resisted by mainstream environmentalists, including mainstream Christian environmentalists. They saw this as anthropocentric, and that's a complicated term, but if you break it down, right, human-centered. They saw it as communities protesting things that were being done to them as human communities, but they didn't see it as sufficiently environmental. It wasn't focusing enough on other species, on the natural environment as that was defined by those mainstream, and again, it's worth noting, predominantly white mainstream groups, right? So the environmental justice movement was met with some resistance from groups like the Sierra Club and other kind of mainstream groups for those reasons. And again, I think the racial component there is significant, right? That fortunately has changed. It took a long time, far too long for it to change, but now religious groups, or sorry, environmentalist groups and religious environmental groups especially, are starting to recognize or have been starting to recognize environmental justice as a really significant environmentalist movement and also a really significant kind of lived theology. Um, in the Barack Obama presidential administration, for example, there has been an Office of Environmental Justice. Robert Bullard, who I mentioned, has worked closely with presidential administrations around that issue of environmental justice. So that shows that greater mainstream acceptance of it. And as I say, in religious environmentalism, in the church, certainly in my experience in the Episcopal Church, we've gotten a lot better about recognizing environmental racism and environmental justice as really significant theological movements and really significant strands within environmentalism and with those religious roots that I mentioned, right? They have always had that key religious component to them. Nonetheless, in 2000, so 18 years after Warren County, when this environmental justice and environmental racism had been a part of the conversation for almost 2 decades. James Cone, the well-known Black liberation theologian, wrote an article asking, "Whose Earth is it anyway?" where he argued that there was still that environmentalism and environmental theology were still far too white. The way that he put it, he said, among other things, said, "There's hardly a hint that perhaps whites could learn something of how we got into this ecological mess from those who have been the victims of white world supremacy." He posed that question and that argument in 2000 and argued there that still Christian environmentalism and eco-theology were paying insufficient attention to the experiences of people of color who were disproportionately affected by these environmental issues. Then, almost 20 years later, at the American Academy of Religion, there was a panel returning to Cohn's article, to his argument, and asking, how far have we come since then? And the conversation, and I attended this, and this was really what kind of spurred my thinking into trying to write this book, because the conversation generally centered on the ways that, again, 20 years after Cohn, almost 40 years after Warren County, Christian environmentalism was still predominantly a white space. And why was that? And what characteristics of Christian environmentalism might be perpetuating this white privilege in those spaces? And this resonated with my own experience. As I said, working in the church, in the Episcopal Church over the last decade in creation care and environmental ministries, my own experiences of working with groups on a parish level, groups on a national church level who didn't see the connections with environmental issues, or if those were brought up, saw that as peripheral or unimportant compared to the work of creation care. I remember conversations where people would literally say, I don't know why we need to be focusing on that. This is a creation care group. This is an environmental ministry group. And so those were the questions and the concerns that I set out to try to understand better in my book. And it was this article and the subsequent panel that really helped catalyze that for me. So before answering that question, I want to say a little bit about what I mean by white. When we ask, is green Christianity white? Here we're talking about whiteness as a social construction. That is, it's not exclusively or primarily about skin color. We're not just talking about white people, but it's a social construction. It's a way of constructing power and privilege and excluding certain people from that, right? A way of protecting some people's privilege and power at the expense of others, and specifically constructing one group as white to protect that privilege and power, and other groups as non-white as a way of excluding them. And then skin color becomes the justification for protecting those privileges, protecting that power. So that's what I mean when I talk about whiteness as a social construction. Of course, it's mapped onto skin color, but that's not the first concern. That's not really what it's fundamentally about. White supremacy, of course, is closely related to this, where whiteness is already about privilege and about a kind of hierarchy, a kind of superiority. White supremacy makes that claim to superiority just more explicit. It's already there in the way whiteness is constructed by society. White supremacy just makes it explicit and valorizes it. It's important to note, too, that it has always been a theological construct. And this is the work of Kelly Brown Douglas in the Episcopal Church and looking at North American constructions of whiteness, and Willie James Jennings, who takes a more global approach and looking at colonialism and the way that it constructed whiteness. But similar claims that theology has always been used to justify this construction of whiteness as superior. Claims that white people were called to save the people that they colonized and oppressed and enslaved, that white people were somehow more holy, closer to God, closer to salvation, and that they had this responsibility to those classes constructed as inferior to try to save them, to try to bring them closer to salvation, which coincidentally, of course, was meant European civilization, right? Meant civilizing them in that vein, right? There were, as you may know, as may be familiar, there were papal documents, papal bulls that were issued specifically saying that the Europeans that discover these lands and claim them for God, because the Europeans were seen as having the authority to do that, that they had the right to all of it, to the people, to the lands, to everything that they owned, and race is explicitly invoked in those documents. It's not the main concern in the documents. The main distinction in the documents is between Christian and infidel, but race is how you know. Race is the kind of recognizable characteristic there. And those documents, the idea of the doctrine of discovery that's in those papal bulls, continued to be used into the 20th century. I think even the 21st century continued to be used to justify property claims of white North Americans over indigenous communities. So continued those papal documents from the 15th century continued to establish legal precedent today. And so that all of that is to say that this has always been a theological issue from the beginning. And so it's important to deconstruct the theologies that are at the heart of it. So in trying to discern what characteristics of Christian environmentalism might be helping to perpetuate this whiteness and the privileging of white experience, the privileging of white perspectives and white commitments in our environmental ministries and in our creation care work, excuse me. I articulate in the book four kind of areas where I think some of these kind of theological and environmental claims are still with us and continue to shape the way we think about environmental issues in ways that privilege whiteness. So the first one that I name is a weak or general conception of justice. You you see justice coming up in environmental conversations and Christian environmental conversations more now than it used to. But many kind of conceptions of creation care don't talk explicitly about justice as a primary concern. And if they do, and this is what I mean by a general conception, they often do it in a sort of holistic and broad way, kind of justice for everyone, justice for people, and for creation. And those are important ideas, and some really important steps have been made using that kind of terminology, that kind of perspective. But as long as our conception of justice is not naming things like environmental racism and colonialism or neocolonialism, is not naming explicitly the ways that environmental issues affect groups, racially constructed groups in different ways, right? And is not naming some of those explicitly. And one of these that I want to that I've sort of alluded to a few times, but I think we don't name often enough and need to, is that all of our environmental ministries, all of our environmental conversations are occurring on land that the European church really has no right to claim, right? And that's if we're not naming that as part of our conception of justice, then we're really missing we're really perpetuating the whiteness that is at the root of all this. But so naming those unequal claims, those unequal effects more directly is what's needed. And too much of our environmental ministry and Christian environmentalism fails to do that. The second one is the way we approach science. It makes sense that Christian environmentalism would be talking about science, would be focusing on science as an ally. And again, that's important, and we've really accomplished a lot with that approach. But some of the ways we incorporate science are relatively unproblematic and need to be a little bit more critical. So one example is often when we turn to ecology, we think of ecology as this science of harmony, as very, very holistic and harmonious, and pointing to the harmonious interdependence of various species and ecosystems. But often that can weaken the claims for justice, and it can weaken our attention to ecosystems and environments that don't display that kind of harmony. In particular, it can weaken our commitment to sites of environmental injustices, sites of pollution, sites of environmental degradation. Like Rachel mentioned that I've worked on mountaintop removal, right? If our conception of ecology is sort of overly focused on this harmony, on this holism, then that's going to lead us to focus less on really deeply degraded systems, right? And that's going to what that's going to do is shift our focus away from sites of environmental injustices. But also the ways that science can and has been used to perpetuate inequality. So in the environmental stories of environmental injustice and environmental racism, you often have examples of corporations, the government, and sometimes even the Environmental Protection Agency using studies to show that there are not unequal environmental harms, using studies to show that people are not being affected in the ways that they say that they are being affected. And because the government and the corporations have access to scientific resources that most communities, and especially since usually we're talking about impoverished communities, that these communities don't have access to. And so that science can be used, that unequal access to the science can be used to perpetuate and to continue to support those environmental injustices, right? So there, it's not necessarily the science that's the issue, but it's the social structures in which that science inevitably operates. And so insofar as Christian environmentalism has tended to rely sort of unproblematically on science and has tended to view science as apolitical, again, that's a way in which we're failing to see the privilege that's inherent in a lot of that environmentalism. The idea of wilderness that is at the root of a lot of our Christian environmentalism is another problem. So some of these ideas of wilderness, we can trace them back in really interesting ways. Of course, wilderness is a really significant idea in the Bible, and actually, the biblical idea of wilderness is much more ambiguous, much more complicated than sort of the romantic ideas of wilderness that have shaped our contemporary consciousness in many ways. The contemporary ideas, the sort of environmentalist visions of wilderness that we have, owe a lot to people like John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club and sort of great figure in environmentalism. But he too had his own blind spots, his own racial blind spots in particular, and that's a whole other kind of story to be told. But it's indicative of the way that our understandings of wilderness that are central to the environmentalist movement in North America um, often involve the erasure, both literal removal from the land and also kind of the ideological erasure of the people who have used and inhabited those spaces, right? The idea of wilderness uh, is often thought of as pristine, as untouched by human hands. That's how Muir himself described it. And it never has been that. It has always been used and lived on and actively managed in some cases by people who predate the white European colonizers that came here. Um, and so conceptions of wilderness as kind of pristine, as this kind of ideal state are complicit in, again, both the ideological erasure as well as the literal removal of the people who were on those lands and the ways that access to those spaces is still unequal. Christopher Carter in the book that I mentioned and in some of his writing talks about the experiences, in the 20th and even the 21st century, the experiences of people of color at national parks being eyed suspiciously or often, sort of being interrogated more than other white visitors to the parks because it's just not seen as a place for them, right? And those are things that continue to happen into the 20th and 21st century. So just again, another example of the way our ideas of wilderness spaces have always been racialized and actually continue to be in ways that if you're white, you may not be aware of. Then finally, and one thing I wanted to note here with this idea of wilderness, this is not really related to Christian environmentalism, but um, we have unfortunately, sadly, seen in the last decade the political resurgence of this idea of replacement theory that you may be familiar with, the fear of white supremacists and many on the sort of extreme right of non-white people coming to North America, to the United States, in order to replace white people and white culture, right? This is the fear that drives many sort of far right extremists. I note that here because it has an environmental character to it often, right? They often invoke these ideas of wilderness, these ideas of these great untouched expanses as one of the sort of inheritances of North America that need to be protected from these non-white invaders that are coming to replace white people, right? That's not this is not part of my criticism of Christian environmentalism. I'm not aware I'm not aware of within sort of mainstream Christian environmentalism, and certainly not in the Episcopal Church of those kind of themes. But when we talk about that idea of wilderness, again, thinking about sort of the contemporary ways that that continues to rear its ugly head, that's one of the most prominent and troubling ones. Then the fourth element that I note is the emphasis on creation accounts, and specifically on the first two chapters of the book of Genesis in our creation care and environmental ministries. Um, that again makes sense. Of course, if we're talking about the environment, if we're talking about creation, we would focus on those two texts, those two creation stories, or at least two creation stories. There's multiple elements that kind of figure in there, and we often talk about them as if there's one kind of coherent story. But part of the reason why those get all the attention is simply because they're the ones that come first in the scripture. There are actually a lot of texts about the creation of creation, about the event of creation, all throughout scripture. They can be found in the Psalms, they can be found in the wisdom literature. Um, and that's just the stories about the event of creation. And then there's far more texts that deal with the creation itself, the creation as a whole, as subject to God's providence and sustenance. And when we only focus on those two Genesis stories, we get a much narrower picture of what Scripture and what theology have to say about the environment, about creation. And in particular, it's one that emphasizes sort of harmonious relationship, emphasizes human stewardship, particularly the second Genesis story of Adam and Eve in the garden, right? We're all, I think, familiar with the troubling implications of ideas like dominion and tilling and keeping, and the special role that is given to human beings in that story, right? Those are some of the ideas that come from that initial Genesis story. And I'm not saying we should do away with or not talk about those texts. But if we bring in some of the other texts, like the story of the conquest of the promised land in Exodus, the story at the other end of the Bible, the stories of Revelation, of God's restoration of creation, not as a garden, but as a city. More ambiguous texts like the book of Job, where humans actually are pretty insignificant, and the whole discourse of Job seems to emphasize just how small a part of the whole creation we are, in contrast to those Genesis stories. And I'll talk a little bit more about a couple of these. But if we incorporate all of the ways that Scripture talks about creation, we get a much more complicated, much more nuanced, and in some ways more political picture of what a normative relationship to creation might look like. So those are the four characteristics that I outline in the text. A weak or general conception of justice, the view of science as neutral and apolitical, the image of wilderness as pristine, that's kind of inherited from mainstream environmentalism, and a narrow emphasis on just those two chapters of Genesis for our creation accounts. And so what I set out to try to articulate in the text is what I describe as an anti-oppressive Christian environmentalism. And I make some suggestions, but I think this is the task, is how do we continue to develop, to continue to recognize these characteristics of whiteness that continue to be pervasive in a lot of our theology and a lot of our ministries, and try to work against those, try to work towards something that would be truly anti-oppressive. Um, Yeah. I'm gonna try not to get too bogged down here. And you may be seeing that word epistemology and epistemological and already sort of checking out because this is where things sometimes get dense. But I'm going to try to make it as clear as possible. Part of what I argue in the text is that whiteness is fundamentally about epistemology. It's about the ways that we know. And from the beginning, and this is I'm taking a lot of this from Willie James Jennings from the text that I mentioned, but part of how whiteness has been constructed and perpetuated has always been about controlling knowledge, controlling who has access to knowledge, who defines what counts as knowledge, and what kinds of knowledge are excluded. So race has historically has always been accompanied by a certain kind of science that claimed to establish it as, scientific fact. Of course, now um, most of us recognize that was all for a scam, that there was no actual science to that. But for centuries, this was seen as accurate scientific knowledge, right? And so that's an example of the way that power controls knowledge, controls what counts as knowledge in order to perpetuate this privilege of whiteness. Another example is the kinds of knowledge that are excluded, right? This relates to race. It also relates to questions of gender, the ways that sort of rational European Enlightenment kind of knowledge has always been privileged at the expense of more embodied forms of knowledge, more emotional forms of knowledge, the kinds of knowledge that would have characterized some of the cultures that were being colonized and oppressed, as well as there's often seen to be a gendered division to the when rationality is privileged, it has been constructed historically as a more male way of knowing, and those kind of claims have often been used to oppress women as well as to oppress people of color, right? So these are the ways that epistemology, that is knowledge, is used to control and perpetuate the white supremacy and white privilege that are in power. So then I turn to some of these texts, and I've alluded to some of these already, as suggesting other ways of knowing theologically, other ways of thinking theologically. I don't want to get into these too much because I do want to make sure we have some time for conversation. But apocalypses, apocalyptic texts, certainly the book of Revelation is the best known, but there are apocalypses throughout Scripture that bring in all sorts of mythic and cosmic imagery and communicate in really oblique and figurative ways and are able in that way to make sort of claims at various levels, often political claims too, but they always incorporate creation in certain ways too. There are a lot of texts in apocalyptic where creation, different parts of creation, have a really active role to play in this conflict between God and evil. Excuse me. The Song of Songs is another really interesting example. And there's a scholar named Mari Jorstad at Duke who published a book on called The Hebrew Bible and Environmental Ethics, where she gets into this some. Because again, it's a text where the boundaries between human beings and nature, and in this case, it's romantic, it's a romantic and a sexual relationship, but the ways that the boundaries between human beings and nature get blurred and transgressed, and the genres at the same time kind of move around, and it shifts from sort of figurative, like from metaphor to actually describing human beings as plants and animals and nature gets in on the action in some ways and gets involved in the relationship between these two people. So another one where the kinds of expression, the kinds of knowledge are just much more ambiguous and complicated and interwoven. And then, of course, the one of the most kind of ambiguous and complicated ideas in Christian theology, that of the incarnation. Um, and in particular, one way that this has been explored is this idea of deep incarnation, that if human flesh is matter, is part of all the matter of the cosmos, and is involved in cycles of nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, that's what Christ takes on. And so Christ literally, physically joins in those cycles, joins with creation. And some theologians kind of use this idea uh, in conjunction with the cosmic Christ, the idea of Christ as Lord over all creation that's expressed in some New Testament texts, as a way of exploring how the incarnation involves not just humans, but all of creation, and in some materialist, physical sorts of ways, right? Um, so those are some of the threads, the theological threads that I sort of start to explore that I think because they're more playful, because they're more ambiguous, more multi-genre, start to challenge sort of the totalizing or monolithic kind of ways of knowing that are involved in constructing whiteness. And so then finally, a couple of the suggestions that I make in the text, and then actually one that I've been developing since, of ways that we can continue to sort of try to problematize and challenge these characteristics of whiteness as they come up in our work and in our ministries. Of course, liturgy is one of the central places where we enact what we value, where we enact our theology in meaningful and concrete ways. And if we go back to what I was just saying about the incarnation, because we are an incarnational faith, of course, what we do when we're gathered as a body made up of bodies in the liturgy is crucial. And there are a couple of traditions, liturgical traditions, that go back centuries, the cosmic liturgy and the liturgy of the poor. And cosmic liturgy more involves all of creation, right? Cosmos is the word that refers to the whole of creation. So not necessarily cosmic like space. It can include that, but cosmic in the sense of the whole cosmos, the whole creation that we're involved in. Um, but both of these are kind of liturgical forms that really incorporate, find ways to bring creation itself or to bring poor people and impoverished communities into the midst of the liturgy in really meaningful ways, right? And there are different kinds of practices that have done that. But what's distinctive about them is it's not it's those elements, those subjects become integrated meaningfully into kind of the core of the liturgy rather than sort of peripheral concerns that we get to outside of the liturgy. And we can think of examples of ways that we try to build on these in contemporary liturgy, but I think that we can always be thinking of how do we do that more substantively? How do we do that in ways that aren't marginal but are really integral? The idea of solidarity and solidarity as an active practice, as a meaningful sharing the burdens of others, bringing upon ourselves the burdens of other people, and I want to emphasize the first way that that has to happen is through listening, is through developing relationships, is through following others. I'll come back to this briefly in the final slide, but in finding ways to decenter ourselves and really follow the lead of other people. Actually, what Rachel described, or actually this was in a conversation before, but um, some of the stuff that they're doing in Province One in their creation of their eco-region network, I think is a good example of this kind of following and listening to other partners rather than trying to take the lead. And those are the sort of things that we need to do. And that's the first step to solidarity. And then I talk about this idea of ecological reparations. Because of environmental justice, or environmental racism, I mean, because of the ways that land and the environment have always been a part of how whiteness and racism are perpetuated. And I'm going to pause here because one aspect of that I haven't really talked about, but um, the monoculture plantation economy of the slave economy had long-lasting environmental impacts, right? And because it was a monoculture, because if you look the soil of parts of the Southeast that were most had the most slave plantations and plantation agriculture continue to be um, ecologically poorer, agriculturally poorer soils now than they were. That's just another example of the historic ways that the constructions of race and of whiteness and white supremacy had direct and lasting impacts on land and people together. They exploited both of those together, which is why when we talk about reparations, if we talk about reparations, and we should talk about reparations, why those conversations need to be environmental as well. Not that that would take the place of the social and economic and political aspects, but there are long-lasting environmental effects that continue to affect communities of color disproportionately. And so there are ways of approaching the idea of reparations that can incorporate the land in meaningful ways. One of those, again, to come back to the point about our churches being on land that we really that European settlers and European churches really have no rightful claim to, is I think our environmental ministries, our environmental conversations always need to at some point talk about in real meaningful ways need to talk about land restitution. That is, how do we find ways to give land or control of land or to cede that control in some way to indigenous communities that were here before the Episcopal Church ever arrived, right? I think that conversation ought always be a part of this conversation around environmental ministry. Related to that, this is my kind of more recent direction, is the critique of private property. The way that private property as an institution has always been constructed and applied in unequal and racially constructed ways. Again, this is a claim from Willie James Jennings, but he argues that war, white supremacy, and environmental degradation together are rooted in what he calls a vision of owned existence and life lived through propertied relations. And so I think that there's an important theological critique of private property. Two of the lay Episcopal theologians that Rachel mentioned at the start, Vita Dutton Scudder and William Stringfellow, that I'm working with now, have really compelling and exciting kind of critiques of that. And I think that's an important aspect of how we start to extricate our environmental thinking from this history of whiteness as well. I'm just gonna continue now. I do have I'll put this slide up, but just sort of the ongoing challenges, I think, how we continue to try to struggle with this, and I can say more about that in the question and answer if we like. But then finally, I just want to put this up, name some of the things that the Center for Religion and Environment here at Sewanee are that we're doing here. Some of it related to these questions of environmental racism and whiteness. We're working together with the Roberson Project, which is the project looking at Sewanee's own historic complicity in the plantation economy and how do we start to explore reparations or reparative action for that. And we're involved with them in that, see some of the other things that we're working on as well. And I'm going to stop there so that we do have some time for some question and answer and discussion if you all are interested.
Well, I'd like to be the first to jump in and thank you, Dr. Thompson, for that incredible presentation. I had my camera off so that my vigorous nodding would not distract everyone else on the webinar. I'm just so grateful to you for taking the time to walk us through all of this really critical information in such a deep and a lovely way. And thank you for your work with all of the other writers that you've lifted up as well to drop into, give us a real grounding in the history of this movement over the last 40 years. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
There is one question in the chat already, and I'll read that and I'll just invite others. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I think we'll have about 10 minutes for questions. And then we'll do a closing prayer and we'll wrap up around, well, depending on where you are, 15 minutes past the hour. So the first question that's come in is from David Lawrence, who asks, what is your thinking about how Christianity has ignored, minimized, or diminished these alternative forms of knowledge? And he comments, it seems clear that American Christians are uncomfortable with desire as a form of knowledge, but I think we are also quite conflicted about apocalypse. And although, as you say, we are an incarnational faith, we can tend to domesticate or defang incarnation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, I think that's absolutely right. I think, and first um I want to qualify in a way that I should have done sooner that when I'm talking about Christian environmentalism, mainstream Christian environmentalism or mainstream Christianity, I'm thinking mainly about the forms of Christianity I'm most familiar with, which is really kind of mainline Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, right? It's important to note that some of what we're talking about. So certainly the environmental justice movement came out of black churches, right? Um, they obviously have not been unaware of these things that folks in my circles are starting to recognize. Likewise, with the point about, especially about apocalypse, right? There are a lot of Christian traditions that really are much better at talking about Revelation and apocalypse than mainline Christianity, right? So I failed to kind of make that to qualify that appropriately before, but I think within that sphere, within the kind of mainline Protestant and Roman Catholic Christianity that many of us I think are familiar with. Yeah, I think it's generally um, characterized by kind of a European Enlightenment rationalist kind of tradition, right? And certainly the Episcopal Church and certainly Anglican theology. Some of the best Enlightenment philosophers were Anglicans, right? Those traditions have developed, and and it's worth noting the Episcopal Church has its own special. I mentioned Sewanee specifically, but the Episcopal Church has its own special complicity in in historical racism and in the plantation economy and all of that. Um, all that's to say, sorry, David, back to your question that um, yes, I think that the the ways that we have constructed our theology have excluded bodies, have excluded kind of the ambiguous, wild, kind of, as I said, really genre bending and poetic and exciting. I mean, most of the really fun stuff in scripture, right? We've tended to shy away from a lot of that. And and I think there's just so much potential there that we're missing out on. Again, to bring it back to my current project, William Stringfellow in particular of the theologians that I'm working with, but the other two as well, uh, really do look a lot to the book of Revelation and to other apocalypses in Scripture because they're so political, because they have so many resources for political resistance. And they are anti-imperial texts. And maybe it's not a coincidence then that the Church of the British Empire didn't pay a lot of attention to the anti-imperial texts, right? So yeah, there's a lot there that I think we have missed because we've often tended towards a uh, more kind of rationalist, kind of what rationally kind of credible kind of theology, right? Something that's a little bit more palatable kind of within that Enlightenment mindset. And I think I think you're seeing in other areas too, a number of theologies that are really starting to unpack that, and certainly feminist and womanist and other theologies from women's perspectives have been among the first to point to more embodied and more emotional forms of knowledge that need to have that can claim real legitimacy alongside the kind of intellectual forms of knowledge that have always kind of predominated. So this is not particularly new, but I think it is getting more traction now, and I think that engagement with environmental thinking with these other kinds of epistemologies is really exciting right now.
Thank you so much. And I think I have a question that I definitely wanted to just ask in this space, which I think has probably been um, pretty well addressed by the fact that we're having a webinar on the topic of Christianity and white supremacy, but it's related to what I was hearing in your reply to David as well. And that's a scenario that comes up a lot in my work with Episcopal parishes when I'm, dropping into different dioceses and dropping into parishes and offering an invitation to get involved in creation justice work. One of the things that I'll frequently hear is, well, we don't have time to do that because we're already doing anti-racism work. And I'd be curious, I think, again, I think it's been mostly explicitly pulled together, but just to bring it down to a really concrete example, especially for folks who might be turning in and thinking about how to talk to their congregation about this, how would you reply to someone who said, well, my parish can't focus on environmental work because we're already tied up in anti-racism
Yeah.
work?
Yeah. I mean, so the first thing that I think I would say to that is wonderful, right? Like, thank God we're at a place where that's the sort of thing that we hear, right? I mean, because there are so many other reasons why people might not do environmental work, and at least that's like that's some real progress. Um, but yeah, I think what you're hinting at already is that I think many of us are recognizing that you can't do these two things separately, right? I likewise, just as I was describing, the same way that if I'm working with somebody doing creation care and they say, well, I really can't focus on issues of racial justice because I'm so focused on creation care, right? You can't do one without the other, and I think it goes the other way too. I think because environmental issues, both in North America and globally, because they so disproportionately affect non-white and non-European and globally non-developed countries. Um, so here's a good example. Um, a text that came out a few years back from a philosopher at Georgetown named Olufemi Taiwo called Reconsidering Reparations. And it's about a philosophy of reparations and an approach, a practical approach to reparations. And he considers sort of different arguments for reparations and argues for what he describes as a world-making approach, right? A constructive approach that thinks about what kind of world do we want to live in. And then he, when he starts to explore what that would actually look like, the first thing that he says we need to address is climate change. He says, like, if we want to think about a world beyond whiteness and colonialism, we have to, the most pressing issue that's impeding that is climate change because it so closely follows the trajectories established by whiteness, white supremacy, and colonialism, right? So that's a global example. There are local examples too. I think parts of some of the ways that communities of color continue to be oppressed in our society are directly related to the environmental harms that they suffer. And so, yeah, I would say just like you can't do the creation care without attending to racial inequality. Likewise, I think we can't adequately attend to racial inequality unless we're looking at the environmental aspects of it as well.
Thank you, Andrew. And Perry, I'm just seeing your mention in the Q&A section about so I'll just lift this up. I think actually you ended up just speaking to this, uh, Andrew. So I think this is good. But Perry, feel free to drop something else in the chat if you want a little more information. So Perry says, I struggle with our tendency to silo creation care and racial justice into specialized ministries and seek ways to detach from the team language that can assuage our parish ministries by assigning that to a unique calling. It seems to me that your work can help us. And I think your answer just did illustrate exactly how it can help us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that that's really clear, the need for that. But I do want to take this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen again, go back to this last slide. Because I just put this up. I didn't name everything, but part of how this all came to be is this ecoregion network project that Rachel and I are collaborating on. And one of the things that's really exciting, this is church-wide, but there are certain ecoregions that have been established, and the province one ecoregion being one of the first. And one of the things that we're seeing, and one of the things that I think is really exciting with this is the way that parishes more broadly and dioceses more broadly and even provinces more broadly are integrating this work into sort of the whole of what they do. And we're seeing different examples of that, different ways that that's happening in the different regions, which is exciting in itself. But I just want to raise up the Episcopal Path work that Rachel has been doing because I think, Rachel, that's been central to how you walk congregations through this, is how to get it out of the Creation Care Committee and I want to praise the work that's been done by these creation care committees for decades, right? The faithful folks who have been working tirelessly on that. But I think projects like yours, Rachel, are looking at ways to bring that out of that, Creation Care Sunday and the handful of people doing their Creation Care Committee and bring it into the heart of what the church does and into sort of the core of everything that we're doing. And so yeah, I think it's absolutely important and I'm grateful to folks like Rachel for the work that they're doing to do that.
Oh, thank you. Well, there's a lot of mutual gratitude in this space. I'm really excited for this opportunity. There's only one other. Oh, there's one specific invitation in the chat, and then I think this will be the last noticing, which is coming from Russell Norris, and then I'll close us in an embodied prayer practice together. David Lawrence is wondering if you could, Andrew, or maybe we could pop this on the YouTube channel when the recording goes live, just to grab that URL um, and put it in the chat for folks so that they have it as a resource of the teaming.sewanee.edu. So that's a little thing. Yes, David, we can get that to you. Um, and then Russell is gonna bring us to conclusion, the last noticing that I'll lift up, and that is perhaps it would help to look at the junction of environmental and racial justice to expand the conversation to include restorative justice, which focuses on how we can move toward a vision of God's original plan for creation. So curious if you have a response to that or if that's
Yeah, I'll just affirm that. I think
great.
I mentioned a moment ago this world making idea that Olufemi Taiwo uses, and I think restorative justice is perhaps a theological way of describing that kind of constructive vision. And I think that's right.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And uh Susan, just to let you know and to let everyone on the call know that yes, we did record this whole conversation, the whole presentation from Dr. Thompson. So that will be available on the Swanee YouTube channel sometime next week. There will be an email that goes out to all registered participants with all of the information. I'll probably put in some notes to make sure people get URLs. So yes, you will have access to all the information from this evening. And I just want to, yeah, just return another gratitude. Thank you so much, Dr. Thompson, for this incredible amount of sharing, for your depth of thinking and presencing, and for lifting up what you've done. This just feels like really essential work, especially in our world right now, at this moment. Just so I'm very grateful to you for your leadership in this, and glad to be able to work with you.
Well, thank you, Rachel.
Uh,
It's been a real pleasure.
yeah. So as a closing